The night air smelled like fresh-cut grass and money. Malcolm Wright felt it the moment he stepped through the iron gate. Quiet, manicured, expensive silence. The kind that swallowed sound. The kind that made headlights linger longer than necessary. The patrol car rolled past once, then slowed, then stopped. Red and blue lights splashed across the white stone driveway, climbing the columns of the mansion behind him like a warning flare. Malcolm kept walking, keys loose in his hand, suit jacket folded over his arm. He'd worked a 14-hour day. His shoulders ached. All he wanted was his front door. "Hey!" a voice called out. Commanding. Already annoyed, Malcolm turned. An officer stepped out, hand resting casually near his holster. Another stayed in the car watching. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked. Malcolm blinked. "I live here." The officer's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's so." The radio crackled softly. Somewhere, sprinklers hissed on a neighbor's lawn. Malcolm noticed how the officer's eyes flicked past him, to the gate, the house, the long driveway, as if Malcolm himself were invisible. "I'm going to need you to put the keys down," the officer said. Malcolm's chest tightened. "Why?" "For my safety." Pause stretched too long. Then the words came, flat and final. "Step away from the property." Something cold slid down Malcolm's spine. Behind him, the house lights clicked on, motion sensors responding to his presence. The officer stiffened. "You're trespassing," he said. "And you're under arrest." Metal cuffs snapped shut. As Malcolm was turned toward the patrol car, he saw the gate camera's red light blinking steadily, recording everything. And he realized, with sudden clarity, that no one here intended to believe him. The street was too quiet for comfort. Malcolm Wright noticed it the moment his tires rolled off the main road and onto the private drive. No music drifting from open windows. No laughter. Just trimmed hedges, glowing porch lights, and the low hum of security systems doing their invisible work. He slowed, easing his car past the wrought iron gate as it slid open automatically. The mansion waited at the end of the drive, all pale stone and clean lines, its windows dark except for the faint glow of a single lamp in the study. Finally. He parked, cut the engine, and sat for a second longer than necessary, shoulders sagging. 14 hours of negotiations, zoning meetings, and polite disbelief that he was the man signing the checks. He loosened his tie, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the cool night. That was when the headlights swept over him. Malcolm turned his head just in time to see a patrol car slowing at the gate. It rolled past, paused, then reversed slightly, red and blue lights flickering on without sound. The colors painted his driveway in harsh strokes. He exhaled through his nose and kept walking. "Sir." The words snapped through the air like a branch breaking. Malcolm stopped and turned. An officer was already out of the car, tall, broad-shouldered, one hand resting near his belt. Another sat behind the wheel, watching. "Yes," Malcolm said. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked. Malcolm glanced around, genuinely confused. "I live here." The officer's eyes moved past him, scanning the house, the driveway, the gate. They returned to Malcolm with something colder. "Aha," the officer said. "You got ID on you." "In my car," Malcolm replied. "And inside." "Then I'm going to need you to put the keys down." Malcolm frowned. "Why?" "For my safety." The night seemed to lean closer, listening. "I'm just trying to go home," Malcolm said carefully. He felt his heartbeat quicken, a familiar warning he hated recognizing. "I own this property." The officer's mouth tightened. "Sir, step away from the house." Malcolm didn't move. "I'm not trespassing on my own." "Step away from the property," the officer repeated, voice sharper now. "Last warning." Behind Malcolm, the porch lights flicked on, triggered by motion sensors. The house responded to him even if the man in front of him wouldn't. The officer stiffened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Malcolm Wright." The officer turned slightly, murmured something into his radio. Static answered. "Turn around," he said. Malcolm's stomach dropped. "Excuse me. You're being detained until we sort this out." Detained. The word carried weight. History. Gravity. "I haven't done anything wrong," Malcolm said. His voice stayed level, but his hands had gone cold. "You can check the property records." Call dispatch. "This is unnecessary." The officer stepped closer. "Turn around. Now." Malcolm hesitated for half a second too long. The officer grabbed his arm. Metal click. Final. The cuffs bit into Malcolm's wrists, shock blooming into anger, then something heavier. He stared at the driveway, at the stone he'd chosen himself, at the place he'd built piece by piece. "This is a mistake," he said quietly. "Tell it to the judge," the officer replied. They walked him toward the patrol car. The other officer avoided his eyes. The gate camera blinked red, steady and unblinking. As Malcolm was guided into the back seat, he caught one last glimpse of his front door, still closed, still waiting. And he understood with chilling certainty that the truth would not be enough tonight. The holding room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Malcolm sat on a metal bench bolted to the floor, his hands still cuffed in front of him, wrists burning where steel met skin. The walls were a dull, exhausted gray, chipped in places where people had leaned too hard, waited too long. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. Laughter followed. Not his. An officer passed the open doorway and slowed, eyes flicking to Malcolm, then away again, like looking too long might require a conversation. "You gonna sit quiet, or you wanna make this difficult?" a voice asked. Malcolm looked up. A different officer stood there now, younger, softer around the edges, clipboard tucked under his arm. His name tag read. No relation, Malcolm thought distantly. "I want a phone call," Malcolm said. Reed nodded, almost relieved. "After processing." "How long is that?" Malcolm asked. Reed shrugged. "Depends." The word landed heavy. "Depends on what?" "Mood. Paperwork. Kin." They led Malcolm down the hall, past cells with men slumped on benches, some asleep, some staring into nothing. One man met Malcolm's eyes and gave a look that was half apology, half warning. At the fingerprint station, another officer took over. This one didn't bother with names. "Hands," he said. Malcolm placed them on the scanner. The glass was cold. "Ever been arrested before?" the officer asked, tone casual, like asking about the weather. "No," Malcolm said. "Huh." The officer smirked. "First time for everything." Machine beep. The officer frowned. "Press harder." "I am," Malcolm said. "Well, it's not reading," the officer replied. "Relax your fingers." Malcolm bit back a response and did as told. The machine beeped again, sharper this time. "Look at that," the officer muttered. "They finally show up." Malcolm stiffened. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," the officer said too quickly. "Just paperwork." They moved him to a desk. Questions followed, rapid and impersonal. "Address." Malcolm gave it. The officer paused, typing. "That's not what's in the report." "What report?" Malcolm asked. "The one that says you were trespassing." Malcolm laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. "I told them. That's my house." The officer glanced up, eyes flat. "You can tell your lawyer." "I'd like to call him now," Malcolm said. The officer sighed, as if Malcolm were being unreasonable. "After intake." Minutes stretched. Or hours. Time blurred into the hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of radios. Malcolm focused on breathing. He replayed the arrest in his head, every word, every movement, wondering where he could have done something differently. A door opened behind him. "Right." Malcolm turned. A supervisor stood there, older, heavier, with tired eyes and a voice practiced in authority. "You're saying the property you were found on belongs to you," the supervisor said. "Yes," Malcolm replied. "And this would have been over already if anyone had checked." The supervisor nodded slowly. "And you're a real estate developer?" "Yes." The supervisor hummed. That area's been having break-ins. Malcolm stared at him. So officers are on alert, the supervisor said. High-value homes. People pretending to belong. People, Malcolm echoed. The supervisor didn't respond. We'll verify ownership. Thank you, Malcolm said. That's all I've been asking. The supervisor hesitated. In the meantime, you'll remain here. For how long? Until we confirm. Malcolm leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pressing down on him. May I make my phone call now? The supervisor glanced at the clock. One call. The phone was mounted to the wall, cord stiff and coiled. Malcolm dialed from memory, heart pounding harder with each ring. Daniel Cho, a voice answered. Daniel, Malcolm said, relief cracking his composure. It's Malcolm. I've been arrested. What? They say I was trespassing. At my house. Silence, then a sharp inhale. Where are you? Malcolm gave the station address. I'm on my way, Daniel said. Do not answer anything else. Do you hear me? Yes. Good. Sit tight. The line went dead. An officer took the phone from Malcolm without comment and led him back to the bench. The cuffs stayed on. Across the room, two officers spoke in low voices. He says it's his place, one said. Yeah, right, the other replied. Did you see that house? Exactly. Malcolm closed his eyes. Another officer walked by, slower this time. He hesitated, then stopped. You okay? The officer asked quietly. Malcolm opened his eyes. No. The officer shifted his weight. I'm Officer Alvarez. Malcolm nodded. They didn't ask me to say this, Alvarez continued, voice low. But sometimes things move slow here. Sometimes, Malcolm repeated. Alvarez looked at the cuffs. You should have never been brought in like this. Then why was I? Malcolm asked. Alvarez swallowed. I don't know. Footsteps echoed down the hall. A man in a suit appeared, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp. Daniel Cho. The room changed instantly. Officers straightened. Conversations stopped. Daniel scanned the room until he saw Malcolm. His jaw tightened. We're done here, Daniel said to no one in particular. Release my client. The supervisor approached, face stiff. We're still verifying. Daniel held up a folder. Deed. Tax records. Utility statements. All in his name. The supervisor flipped through the pages, color draining from his face. I want the cuffs off, Daniel said. The metal clicked open. Malcolm flexed his wrists, pain blooming and fading. As they walked toward the exit, Malcolm glanced back once. Officers avoided his gaze. The logbook sat open on the desk, his name already written in ink. Side cameras flashed. Someone had noticed. And Malcolm realized this wasn't ending tonight. The night outside the station felt louder than the one Malcolm had left. Cameras clicked in sharp bursts, their flashes slicing through the dark as he stepped out beside Daniel. Questions flew immediately, voices overlapping, urgent and hungry. Sir, is it true you were arrested for trespassing? Do you own the property? Do you believe race played a role? Daniel raised a hand. No statements tonight. Malcolm said nothing. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, the weight of the station still clinging to him like a bad smell. They pushed through the small crowd and into Daniel's car. The doors shut, sealing off the noise. Only then did Malcolm exhale. Jesus, Daniel muttered, starting the engine. They actually booked you. They kept saying verification, Malcolm replied. Like my life was a clerical error. Daniel glanced at him. That's exactly how they see it sometimes. They drove in silence for several blocks. Streetlights streaked past the windshield. Malcolm watched them blur, each one pulling him further from the version of the night he'd expected. You're lucky someone tipped off local press, Daniel said finally. Otherwise, this might have disappeared into paperwork. I didn't call anyone, Malcolm said. Daniel nodded. Someone saw you leave the station. Or heard the radio traffic. Doesn't matter. It's out now. Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes. The cuffs were gone, but his wrists still throbbed. At home, the gate slid open again, obedient as ever. The house lights warmed the driveway, unchanged, indifferent. Malcolm stepped inside and paused, hand still on the doorframe, as if crossing the threshold required permission. "Tomorrow," Daniel said quietly behind him. "We request body cam footage. Dispatch logs. Everything." Malcolm nodded. "I don't want this buried." "It won't be," Daniel said. "Not anymore." After Daniel left, Malcolm wandered through the house, touching familiar things like he was proving they were real. The kitchen counter, the staircase rail, the framed photo of his parents in the hallway, smiling in front of the first duplex he'd ever bought. Sleep didn't come. When it did, it was shallow and sharp-edged, full of flashing lights and voices repeating the same question. "What are you doing here?" Morning arrived with notifications. Texts, missed calls, emails stacked like bricks. By noon, the video was everywhere. Malcolm sat at his dining table, laptop open. The body cam footage paused on a still frame of himself standing in his driveway. Hands visible, posture calm. The officer's voice echoed even before he hit play. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm watched, jaw clenched, as the scene unfolded exactly as he remembered, and worse. Pauses. The assumptions. The moment the officer said, "Step away from the property," like Malcolm's presence itself was a threat. Comments scrolled beneath the video. "Why didn't he just comply? Looks suspicious to me. That house. No way it's his." Malcolm slammed the laptop shut. The phone rang immediately after. "Malcolm Wright?" a woman asked when he answered. "Yes. This is Karen Blake from Channel 6 News. We'd like to get your perspective." Malcolm hesitated. "I'm not interested in being a spectacle." "I understand," she said smoothly. "But others are already speaking for you." He closed his eyes. "Give me an hour." The interview took place in his living room. Lights, microphones, careful questions. "How did it feel," Karen asked, "to be arrested outside a mansion you own?" The phrasing burned. "It felt," Malcolm said slowly, "like my success was being put on trial." The clip aired within minutes. City officials released a statement shortly after. "The department takes all allegations seriously. An internal review is underway." No apology. No acknowledgement. Daniel arrived that afternoon with a stack of papers and a grim expression. "They're circling the wagons," he said. "Unions already defending the officer. What about the supervisor?" Malcolm asked. "Claims protocol." Malcolm laughed bitterly. "Protocol didn't put me in cuffs. People did." A knock came at the door. An officer stood outside. Younger. Nervous. "Mr. Wright?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Officer Alvarez," he said. "From last night." Malcolm studied him. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Alvarez said. "But I needed to say this in person." Daniel stepped closer, protective. Alvarez swallowed. "I spoke to Internal Affairs. Gave a statement." Malcolm's eyebrows lifted. "Why?" "Because what happened was wrong," Alvarez said. "And because I didn't speak up soon enough." Silence stretched between them. "They told us the homeowner was unverified," Alvarez continued. "That you matched a profile." "What profile?" Malcolm asked quietly. Alvarez looked down. "Suspicious presence." Malcolm nodded slowly. "In my own driveway." "Yes," Alvarez said. "I'm sorry." After he left, Malcolm sat heavily on the couch. "They knew," he said. "Or they didn't care." Daniel placed the papers on the table. "Here's the thing. A deed. Taxes. The security footage. It's all clear. So why does this still feel like I'm losing?" Malcolm asked. Daniel didn't answer. That evening, the arresting officer appeared on television. "We acted on reasonable suspicion," he said, uniform crisp, expression firm. "If Mr. Wright felt inconvenienced, That's unfortunate. Inconvenienced. Malcolm watched the screen, something inside him hardening. They're not backing down, he said. No, Daniel replied. Which means neither can you. Malcolm looked around the room. His room. His house. His proof. They wrote my name in their logbook, he said. Like it belonged there. Daniel nodded. Now we make sure they never forget it. Malcolm stood, resolve settling into his bones. For the first time since the cuffs closed, he felt steady. They had reduced him to ink on paper. Now the paper would speak. By the next morning, Malcolm's name no longer belonged to him. It moved faster than he could follow, sliding across screens, whispered between anchors, stitched into headlines that felt both cautious and accusatory. Man arrested outside luxury home claims ownership. Police say stop was procedural. Questions raised. Malcolm watched from his kitchen as a news van parked across the street. Another followed. The quiet he'd paid so much for evaporated under the low thrum of generators and the murmur of voices just beyond his gate. They found you, Daniel said over the phone. I know, Malcolm replied, staring through the window. They're standing on my sidewalk. That sidewalk is public, Daniel said. They'll push until you push back. The body cam video hit national feeds at noon. This version was edited tighter, stripped of context but heavy with implication. The officer's voice sounded calmer than Malcolm remembered. Malcolm's own responses were clipped, flattened. His hesitation framed as defiance. Pause it, Malcolm said. The producer hesitated. We're live in 30. Pause it, Malcolm repeated. The screen froze on his face mid-sentence. Eyes steady, shoulders squared. He barely recognized himself. That's the frame they'll use, the producer said quietly. It reads, confrontational. Malcolm exhaled. That's my neutral face. She nodded, not arguing. The segment aired anyway. Within minutes, the comments poured in. Why was he there so late? Real owners don't walk in like that. Money doesn't erase behavior. Malcolm closed the laptop and pressed his palms to the counter, grounding himself in cool stone. A knock came at the door. This one was firmer. Karen Blake stood there again, flanked by a cameraman and a sound tech. May we? She asked. Malcolm considered the driveway, the house behind him, the choice he hadn't asked for but was now forced to make. 5 minutes, he said. They filmed him standing beneath the staircase, light falling clean and bright across his face. Karen's tone was softer this time. You've been described as unexpectedly wealthy, she said. What's your response? Malcolm didn't flinch. That phrase says more about the speaker than it does about me. Karen nodded. Some viewers believe this was a misunderstanding. It wasn't, Malcolm said. It was an assumption. The clip aired that evening. The department responded an hour later. We are committed to transparency. An internal review is ongoing. No conclusions have been reached. The arresting officer declined further comment. Union representatives did not. This officer followed training, the union president said on a late-night panel. We won't allow our members to be vilified for doing their jobs. Malcolm watched from his living room, lights off, the glow of the television carving shadows across the walls. They're building a shield, he said. Daniel sat across from him, legal pad balanced on his knee. Which means they expect impact. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Daniel gestured. Answer it. This is Malcolm Wright, Malcolm said. Mr. Wright, a woman replied. My name is Denise Carter. I live 2 blocks over. Malcolm straightened. Yes. They stopped my son last year, Denise said. Right outside your gate. Said he didn't belong. Malcolm swallowed. I didn't know. No, Denise said gently. How would you? Another call came in before he could respond. Then another. By midnight, Malcolm had heard 6 stories. Different faces. Same words. Suspicious. Out of place. Didn't belong. He sat in silence long after the calls stopped, the weight of it pressing against his chest. The next morning, an envelope appeared at his gate. No return address. Inside was a printed screenshot of the police blotter entry. Subject arrested for trespassing on private property. Beneath it, in red ink, someone had written, "They do this to all of us." Malcolm stared at the page, something cold and clarifying settling in his gut. At City Hall, officials scrambled. Emails leaked. A council member resigned himself to a microphone and spoke about optics. The mayor promised accountability without naming anything specific. Internal Affairs requested Malcolm's formal testimony. Daniel reviewed the request. "This is the moment," he said. "They'll ask you to keep it narrow." Malcolm nodded. "I won't." Inside the IA office, the air felt deliberately neutral. Beige walls, glass table. Two investigators, neither meeting his eyes for long. "Describe the encounter," one said. Malcolm did. "What did the officer say?" the other asked. Malcolm repeated the words exactly. The investigator scribbled, then paused. "Did you feel threatened?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "Why?" Malcolm looked up. "Because I knew the truth wouldn't matter." The room went quiet. That afternoon, the arresting officer gave a longer interview. "I can't read minds," he said. "I see behavior." "What behavior?" the interviewer pressed. "Evasive," the officer replied. Malcolm laughed aloud when he heard it. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. They always had a word. That evening, a national outlet ran a headline Malcolm couldn't ignore. "He built the house they arrested him outside." The framing shifted. Not far. Not enough. But slightly. Daniel smiled thinly. "Cracks," he said. "They're small, but they're there." Malcolm stood by the window again, watching the vans pack up for the night. The street grew quiet once more, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. And Malcolm understood something then, with unsettling clarity. This story was no longer about a mistake. It was about patterns. And patterns didn't disappear quietly. The letter arrived by courier, thick paper inside a sealed envelope, the city's crest embossed at the top like a warning. Malcolm opened it at the kitchen counter, hands steady despite the tightness in his chest. Notice of internal review. Conditions. Language polished until it said almost nothing at all. "They want control," Daniel said, reading over his shoulder. "They always do. What happens if I refuse?" Malcolm asked. Daniel met his eyes. "They'll proceed without you." Malcolm folded the letter carefully. "Then I'll be there." The hearing took place in a municipal building downtown, the kind designed to feel important and unremarkable at the same time. Long corridors, frosted glass, flags placed just so. They led Malcolm into a conference room already half full. Officials sat along one side of the table, suits in varying shades of gray. At the far end, a union representative leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The arresting officer wasn't there. Not yet. An investigator cleared his throat. "Mr. Wright, thank you for coming." Malcolm nodded. "I'm here to tell the truth." The investigator smiled thinly. "Of course." They began with background questions. Employment, education, property ownership. Malcolm answered calmly, each response clipped, factual. He noticed how often pens paused when he spoke, how eyes flicked upward when he named institutions, numbers, assets. "And on the night in question," the investigator said, "you returned to your residence at approximately 11:47, Malcolm finished. "Yes. Did you consider that your presence might appear unusual?" another official asked. Malcolm looked at him. "Unusual to whom?" The room stilled. The official adjusted his glasses. "Given the area." Malcolm leaned forward. "I chose that area. I paid for that area. I belong in that area." Silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. The arresting officer entered halfway through. He walked in with practiced ease, uniform crisp, shoulders squared. He didn't look at Malcolm as he took his seat. The union representative placed a hand on his arm. "We'll now hear from Officer Hayes," the investigator said. Hayes spoke smoothly, recounting the stop in language stripped of emotion. Observed subject. Requested compliance. Escalation avoided. When Mr. Wright claimed ownership, Hayes said, there was no immediate verification available. "Did you attempt verification?" Malcolm asked before he could stop himself. The investigator raised a hand. "Mr. Wright." "No," Malcolm said, voice steady. "I'd like him to answer." Hayes glanced up then, eyes cool. "Dispatch was busy." "With what?" Malcolm pressed. Hayes shrugged. "Active calls." Malcolm nodded slowly. "So you chose arrest?" Hayes stiffened. "I chose procedure." Daniel leaned forward. "Procedure does not require handcuffing a compliant individual without cause." The investigator scribbled notes, eyes darting between them. After 2 hours they recessed. In the hallway, Malcolm leaned against the wall, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The building hummed softly around him, indifferent. A woman approached hesitantly. She wore a badge, her hair pulled back tight. "Mr. Wright?" she asked. "I'm Deputy Commissioner Hall." Malcolm straightened. "Yes." She lowered her voice. "Off the record, this department has a problem." Malcolm studied her face. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one on trial?" Hall sighed. "Because systems protect themselves first." The hearing resumed with testimony from Officer Alvarez. He spoke quietly, hands clasped in front of him. "I believed the situation was being escalated unnecessarily." Hayes shifted in his chair. Alvarez continued. "Mr. Wright was calm, cooperative. There was no threat." The union representative cleared his throat loudly. "Officer Alvarez," the investigator said, "are you suggesting misconduct?" "I'm suggesting judgment," Alvarez replied. "And that it failed." A murmur rippled through the room. By the time it ended, Malcolm felt hollowed out. Outside, protesters had gathered, some holding signs in support, others shouting about law and order. Cameras swung toward him as he stepped into the sunlight. "Do you feel justice is being served?" someone yelled. Malcolm stopped. "I feel like justice is being negotiated," he said. "And that should concern everyone." The city released another statement that evening. "The officer has been placed on administrative leave pending further review." The word leave hung heavy. Daniel tossed the phone onto the couch. "They're buying time." "How much?" Malcolm asked. "Enough to see if public attention fades." Didn't. More footage surfaced. Dispatch logs. Emails between supervisors discussing optics. A pattern began to form, ugly and undeniable. A civil suit was filed before the week ended. The union pushed back hard. "This is an attack on policing," the president declared. "We cannot allow officers to be punished for perception." Malcolm listened from his study, lights low, city noise filtering in through the windows. Perception. That night, sleep came only in fragments. He woke before dawn, heart racing, the echo of cuffs tightening replaying behind his eyes. He sat at the edge of his bed and pressed his feet to the floor. "I won't disappear," he said aloud, testing the words. Morning brought another envelope, this one thinner. Inside was a single page. "Officer Hayes has been terminated." Malcolm read it twice. Daniel called moments later. "It's real," he said. "They cut him loose." Malcolm closed his eyes. Relief flickered, then dimmed. "And the others?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "Reprimands. Training." Malcolm nodded slowly. That afternoon, he stood alone in his driveway, sunlight warming the stone beneath his feet. The same place, the same space, different meaning. They had removed one man. The system remained. Malcolm looked toward the gate, where cameras blinked quietly, always watching. This wasn't victory, but it was consequence. And consequences, once started, had a way of spreading. The first email arrived at dawn. Malcolm read it while standing barefoot in his kitchen, coffee cooling untouched beside him. The subject line was simple. This happened to me too. The sender was a man named Robert Miles. He lived 3 streets over. The message was short, almost apologetic. I didn't want trouble, but I saw what they did to you. Felt familiar. By noon there were 7 more. Different names, different blocks, same story. Stopped while walking, questioned while driving, asked where they were headed, as if movement itself required permission. Malcolm sat at his desk, scrolling slowly, feeling the weight of it accumulate like pressure in his chest. They weren't isolated, he said quietly. Daniel stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, nodding as someone spoke on the other end. He ended the call and turned back. No. And now people feel safe enough to say it out loud. A meeting was scheduled that afternoon. Not official, not public. A living room gathering, chairs pulled close, voices low. Malcolm recognized the hesitation in their faces as they arrived. He had worn it himself not long ago. Denise Carter came first, her son beside her. Then Robert. Then a young woman who lived closer to the main road, hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee. I thought it was just me, she said. It never is, Malcolm replied. They spoke in fragments at first, testing the space. Then the words came faster. I was pulled over twice in 1 week. They said my car didn't match the neighborhood. He asked if I worked there. Each sentence landed like a small weight dropped onto a growing pile. Daniel listened, pen moving steadily across his pad. This isn't just testimony, he said finally. It's evidence. Malcolm looked around the room. What do we do with it? Daniel met his gaze. We show the pattern. The city reacted predictably. Officials framed the growing accounts as anecdotal. The union warned against mob narratives. A spokesperson reminded viewers that policing required discretion. Discretion, Malcolm thought, seemed to have a narrow range. Internal Affairs reopened its inquiry. This time it expanded. Officer Hayes' file was reviewed again. Complaints surfaced. Old ones, dismissed ones, ones marked insufficient evidence. Stops without citations. Warnings without cause. Why wasn't this addressed before? Malcolm asked Daniel. Because paperwork absorbs blame, Daniel replied. People don't. A whistleblower emerged 2 days later. Officer Alvarez didn't go public, not yet. But his statement leaked. There is an informal understanding of who belongs in certain areas. The phrase echoed across headlines. City Council convened an emergency session. Cameras lined the back wall as officials debated language instead of solutions. Malcolm was invited to speak. He stood at the podium, suit pressed, posture steady, the room humming with tension. I am not here because I want attention, he said. I am here because silence was costing too much. Murmurs rippled. I complied, Malcolm continued. I identified myself. I was calm. And it still wasn't enough. A council member leaned forward. What would you have us do? Malcolm didn't hesitate. Change what you excuse. Outside, protesters filled the steps. Some carried signs with his name. Others carried ones that didn't mention him at all. We belong. This is home. The civil case expanded. More plaintiffs joined. The scope widened from one arrest to a culture. Depositions were scheduled. Subpoenas issued. Daniel reviewed documents late into the night, eyes bloodshot but sharp. They trained this behavior, he said. Or at least allowed it. Malcolm sat across from him, the house quiet around them. And if they fight, they will, Daniel replied. Hard. The pressure reached the department by week's end. 2 supervisors were placed on leave. Mandatory body cam audits were announced. The mayor promised reform with the careful tone of someone measuring fallout. Still, the resistance was loud. A radio host mocked Malcolm's story, suggesting wealth had made him sensitive. Malcolm turned the radio off mid-sentence. Sleep became elusive again. He found himself checking the gate cameras at night, watching shadows shift, wondering when vigilance had replaced rest. One evening, he stood on his balcony, city lights stretching beyond the trees. His phone buzzed. It was Alvarez. "They're watching me," Alvarez said quietly. "I'm being reassigned." "I'm sorry," Malcolm replied. Alvarez paused. "I don't regret it." Neither did Malcolm. A draft settlement circulated. The numbers were substantial. The language was careful. Daniel slid it across the table. "This is their attempt to contain it." Malcolm scanned the pages. "It doesn't say anything about policy." "No," Daniel agreed. "Just money." Malcolm pushed it back. "Then it's not enough." Daniel studied him. "You know what walking away from this could cost." "I already know the cost of staying quiet," Malcolm said. The decision spread quickly. Malcolm Wright rejects settlement offer. The headline shifted again. Public opinion fractured. Supporters praised his resolve. Critics accused him of grandstanding. Malcolm absorbed it all with quiet resolve. He stood once more in his driveway late one night, hands in his pockets, listening to the soft hum of the gate. This was where it had started. One assumption. Now it was many voices, refusing to be absorbed by silence. The pattern had been exposed. And patterns once seen could not be unseen. The hearing room was larger this time. Not the quiet municipal conference space where language had been softened and responsibility diluted, but a formal chamber with microphones fixed to polished desks and cameras mounted high, unblinking. The city seal hung behind the dais, heavy with implication. Malcolm sat at the witness table, hands folded, breathing measured. He could feel the room watching him before anyone spoke. Every shift of posture felt amplified. Every silence carried weight. Daniel leaned close. "Say only what's true," he murmured. "Let them do the rest." Across the room, Officer Hayes sat with his attorney. He looked smaller out of uniform, shoulders drawn inward, jaw set tight. He still hadn't looked at Malcolm. The chairwoman called the session to order. "Officer Hayes," she began, "you are here in connection with conduct unbecoming and violation of departmental standards." Hayes nodded once. The first witness was a supervisor. Then another. Dispatch logs were entered into record. Emails followed, displayed on screens too large to ignore. Malcolm listened as phrases he'd grown used to hearing, procedure, judgment, context, were repeated like charms meant to ward off consequence. Then it was his turn. "Mr. Wright," the chairwoman said, "please describe the impact of the incident." Malcolm leaned toward the microphone. The soft hum of electricity filled the pause. "I was arrested for existing," he said calmly. "For walking toward my front door." A murmur rippled through the room. "I lost sleep," Malcolm continued. "I lost a sense of safety I didn't realize was fragile. And I learned that my achievements were conditional." The attorney rose. "Objection, speculative." "Overruled," the chairwoman said. Malcolm's gaze never left the panel. This wasn't about one officer. It was about permission. He finished and leaned back. Officer Alvarez testified next. His voice shook at first, then steadied. "There was no threat," Alvarez said. "No reason to escalate. I should have intervened sooner." Hayes' attorney questioned him sharply, suggesting confusion, exaggeration, bias. Alvarez didn't waver. "I know what I saw." The room grew quiet. After hours of testimony, the panel recessed. When they returned, the chairwoman didn't waste words. "Officer Hayes," she said, "your termination stands." Hayes exhaled sharply, shoulders slumping. His attorney whispered urgently, but Hayes barely responded. "There will be no reinstatement," the chairwoman continued. "Your actions demonstrated a failure of judgment inconsistent with departmental values." Cameras flashed. Outside, reporters surged forward as Malcolm exited the building. "Do you feel vindicated?" someone shouted. Malcolm stopped. I feel accountable, he said. And I hope the city does too. Behind him, union representatives gathered quickly, voices raised. This is scapegoating, one declared. An officer sacrificed to appease public pressure. Malcolm didn't turn back. The civil trial moved swiftly after that. Depositions were tense. Evidence mounted. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was documented. Emails showed supervisors advising officers to be proactive in certain neighborhoods. Training materials emphasized instinct. Performance reviews rewarded high stop counts. The jury watched silently as the picture formed. Daniel's closing argument was precise. This case is not about intent, he said. It is about impact. And impact, when repeated, becomes policy. The verdict came late on a Friday. Liability established. Damages awarded. Mandatory reforms ordered. The numbers made headlines. The reforms barely did. Malcolm stood on the courthouse steps, sun warm against his face, as Daniel shook his hand. You won, Daniel said. Malcolm nodded, but his expression didn't change. That evening, his house was quiet again. No cameras. No vans. Just the soft click of the gate closing behind him as he returned home. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the dining table, the same place where he'd watched the footage weeks ago. The wood felt familiar under his palms. The phone buzzed. A message from Denise. Thank you for not settling. Another from Robert. They apologized to me today. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly. Later he watched the news. The mayor stood at a podium, flanked by officials, promising change. We have learned, the mayor said. And we are committed. Malcolm turned the television off before the applause. Change he'd learned was rarely loud. It happened slowly, in margins, resisted at every step. He stepped outside onto the balcony. The city stretched below him, lights scattered like 1,000 quiet stories. Somewhere down there, people moved through spaces that questioned them, that measured their belonging. His phone rang again. Unknown number. He answered. This is Malcolm Wright. Oz. Then a voice. Older. Tired. This is Officer Hayes. Malcolm stiffened. Why are you calling? Hayes cleared his throat. I wanted to say. I didn't see it then. Malcolm said nothing. I thought I was doing my job, Hayes continued. I didn't think about what it cost you. Silence hung between them. That doesn't undo anything, Malcolm said finally. I know, Hayes replied. I just needed you to know I understand now. Malcolm considered that. Understanding arrived late. Often too late. Goodbye, he said. He ended the call and stood still, listening to the city breathe. Consequences had landed. Not cleanly, not evenly, but undeniably. One officer was gone. Policies were rewritten. A line had been drawn where silence once lived. Malcolm returned inside and locked the door. The house felt the same. He did not. The silence came back slowly. Not all at once, but in fragments. One quiet morning, one uninterrupted night, one driveway free of vans and cables. Malcolm noticed it in the way the street resumed its old rhythm, sprinklers clicking on at dawn, joggers passing without slowing, neighbors returning to polite distance. He should have felt relief. Instead, the quiet pressed on him differently now, heavier, more deliberate, like something learned instead of earned. Malcolm woke before sunrise most days. The house, once a refuge, had become alert with him. Every creak registered. Every shadow lingered a beat too long. He moved through the rooms carefully, as if the walls themselves remembered. He installed new cameras, better lighting, reinforced gates. Each upgrade felt less like security and more like admission. You don't need to do all this, Daniel said one afternoon, watching technicians adjust angles along the fence. Malcolm nodded. I know. He still did it anyway. The settlement funds arrived quietly, routed through accounts already full enough to absorb them without notice. Malcolm barely glanced at the numbers. Money had never been the point. It still wasn't. The reforms began unevenly. A memo circulated about revised stop protocols. Another announced bias training sessions. Attendance was mandatory. Engagement was not. Malcolm read about it all in clipped articles. His name mentioned less frequently now, as if the story had exhausted its usefulness. He returned to work in measured steps. Meetings resumed. Projects advanced. People congratulated him in low voices, careful not to linger on the subject that made them uncomfortable. "You're handling this well," a colleague said once, hand resting briefly on Malcolm's arm. Malcolm smiled politely. He did not correct the assumption. At night, he dreamed of keys slipping from his hand, of gates that wouldn't open, of voices asking the same question again and again. "What are you doing here?" Some mornings, he stood at the edge of his driveway longer than necessary, grounding himself in the cool stone beneath his feet. He reminded himself of facts, of ownership, and proof. Facts, he had learned, were not armor. One evening, he attended a community meeting downtown. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, familiar tension. A man stood and spoke about fear. A woman spoke about exhaustion. A teenager spoke about planning routes home that avoided certain streets. Malcolm listened from the back of the room, anonymous now. His story folded into the larger fabric of theirs. Afterward, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Wright?" he asked. "Yes. I just wanted to say. Seeing you stand up made it easier for my mom to talk about what happened to her." Malcolm nodded, throat tight. "I'm glad." The young man hesitated. "Does it get easier?" Malcolm considered the question carefully. "It gets clearer," he said. "Not easier, but clearer." That night, Malcolm stood on his balcony again, city lights flickering below. He thought about clarity, how it arrived not as peace but as acceptance. The phone rang less now. When it did, it was usually work, or Daniel checking in. "How are you sleeping?" Daniel asked once. Malcolm laughed softly. "I'm not." Daniel sighed. "That's honest." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if there hadn't been cameras," Malcolm said. Daniel didn't answer right away. "I know." The house settled into routine again, but Malcolm didn't. He moved through days with a quiet vigilance that never fully shut off. One afternoon he received a letter. Handwritten. Careful. "Dear Mr. Wright. Our department is reviewing its practices. I won't pretend it's enough. But your refusal to stay silent changed how I see my badge." The letter was unsigned. Malcolm folded it and placed it in a drawer with others like it. Notes from strangers. Thank yous. Confessions. Apologies. Evidence of impact that wouldn't make headlines. He attended one final court-mandated meeting as an observer. Rows of officers sat stiffly, eyes forward, a presenter speaking about bias with slides and bullet points. Malcolm watched faces close, watched others shift uncomfortably. Change, he realized, would not be unanimous. On the drive home, a patrol car passed him. Not fast, not slow, just present. Malcolm felt his shoulders tense automatically. The car continued on. He exhaled, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. That night, he cooked for himself for the first time in weeks. Simple food. Familiar motions. The normalcy felt fragile but welcome. He ate at the kitchen counter, alone, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Later he turned off the lights one by one. In the dark, he stood still, allowing the silence to exist without interrogating it. He thought about the version of himself who had walked up that driveway weeks ago, keys loose in his hand, expecting nothing more than rest. That man was gone. In his place stood someone more cautious, more aware, less willing to assume safety. Not broken. Changed. Before bed, Malcolm stepped outside one last time. The night air was cool, familiar. The gate stood closed behind him, light steady. He placed his palm against the stone pillar and felt its solidity. "I'm still here," he said quietly. The words weren't defiant. They weren't triumphant. They were factual. Inside, the house waited. The lights faded. And Malcolm learned to live in the aftermath, not as an ending, but as a new beginning he hadn't chosen, but would carry forward all the same. The invitations went out quietly. No press release. No announcement. Just messages, calls, word passed carefully from one person to another. Malcolm wanted the gathering to feel intentional, not performative. He wanted people to come because they chose to, not because they were watching. On a Saturday afternoon, cars lined the street outside his gate. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now stepped onto the driveway with cautious curiosity. Some carried food. Others brought nothing but themselves. Malcolm stood near the entrance, greeting each person with a steady smile. He noticed the way eyes moved, not just to him but to the house behind him. Columns, the wide windows, the space that had once triggered suspicion now framed conversation. "This is your place?" a woman asked softly. "Yes," Malcolm replied. "Welcome." Chairs were arranged in a wide circle on the lawn. No podium, no microphone, just open air and equal ground. The late sun softened the edges of everything, casting long shadows that felt more gentle than ominous. Daniel arrived last, standing back, observing. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. Malcolm nodded. "It's time." When everyone had settled, Malcolm stepped forward. "I didn't invite you here to relive what happened," he began. "I invited you to decide what happens next." The words hung in the air, unforced. "This house became a symbol," Malcolm continued. "Not because it's big or expensive, but because it challenged an assumption." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some familiar, new. "I was arrested here because someone decided I didn't belong. I don't want this place remembered for that." A man in the second row raised his hand. "Then what do you want it remembered for?" Malcolm smiled slightly. "Ownership." Murmurs rippled. "Not ownership as possession," Malcolm clarified, "but ownership as responsibility, as presence, as care." Denise stood then, her voice clear. "My son walks past this gate every day. For the first time, he feels like it means something different." Malcolm met her gaze, gratitude settling quietly between them. Others spoke. A teacher described explaining the case to her students. A retired veteran talked about watching the hearings with conflicted pride. A young woman admitted she'd avoided the neighborhood for years, convinced she'd be questioned. As the stories layered, Malcolm listened more than he spoke. This wasn't about directing a narrative. It was about making space. Eventually silence returned. Malcolm took a breath. "I'm not healed," he said. "And I don't think that's required." He glanced back at the house. "But I am grounded. And I want this space to be useful." He gestured toward the lawn. "Community meetings. Legal clinics. Whatever helps." No applause followed. Just nods. Agreement that didn't need volume. As the sun dipped lower, conversations broke into smaller clusters. Laughter surfaced, tentative at first, then easier. Children chased each other across the grass, their shouts light and unburdened. Malcolm stood near the edge, watching. For the first time since that night, the house felt alive in a way that didn't demand vigilance. Daniel joined him. "You changed the meaning of the place," he said. Malcolm shook his head. "They tried to change mine. This is me taking it back." As evening settled, guests began to leave. Hugs replaced handshakes. Promises of follow-up replaced polite goodbyes. When the last car pulled away, Malcolm remained outside, the gate closing slowly behind it. The street was quiet again, but this quiet felt earned. Inside, Malcolm moved through the house with deliberate calm. The rooms no longer echoed with questions. They held memory, yes, but also intention. He paused in the entryway, fingers brushing the wall where he'd once leaned, cuffed and disbelieved. The paint was smooth beneath his hand. He didn't flinch. Later, Malcolm sat in his study, lights low, a single lamp illuminating the desk. He opened a notebook and wrote one line. Belonging is not granted. It is lived. He closed the notebook and leaned back, eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the cameras blinked softly, doing their quiet work. He didn't resent them anymore. They were tools, not proof. Malcolm thought of Officer Hayes, of Alvarez, of the faces in the hearing room, of the way accountability arrived imperfectly, late, but real enough to leave marks. Justice, he understood now, was not a moment. It was maintenance. The phone buzzed once. A message from Daniel. "Proud of you." Malcolm smiled faintly and set the phone aside. He turned off the lamp and stood in the dark, letting the house settle around him. The night air slipped through a cracked window, cool and steady. Once, this silence had felt like judgment. Now it felt like choice. Malcolm stepped onto the balcony one final time. The city stretched outward, imperfect and breathing, full of stories intersecting and diverging beyond his view. He rested his hands on the railing. "This is home," he said softly. The words carried no challenge, no defense, just truth. Behind him, the lights inside the house dimmed automatically, responding to his movement. The systems worked. The structure held. And Malcolm Wright stood where he belonged, not because he had proven it, but because he had claimed it, endured it, and refused to let it be taken again. The gate remained closed. The space remained his. And the story finally was no longer about arrest, but about ownership that could not be undone. Time did not soften the memory. It rearranged it. Weeks passed, then months, and Malcolm learned that healing was less about forgetting and more about carrying weight differently. The house settled into routine again. Meetings in the living room once a week, legal clinics every other Saturday, neighbors who now waved instead of watched. Still, some mornings, Malcolm woke with his jaw tight, the echo of a command ringing in his ears. Step away from the property. He no longer startled at patrol cars, but he noticed them. Awareness had become a second language, one he hadn't asked to learn. The city released its annual report in late spring. Buried deep in the document were statistics that mattered: reduced discretionary stops in high-income neighborhoods, revised training language, a pilot program pairing officers with community advocates. The mayor highlighted progress in a press conference. Malcolm read the report alone, seated at his kitchen table, sunlight warming the page. Progress looked small when measured against damage. Still, it existed. Daniel called that afternoon. "They're citing your case again," he said. Quietly. Malcolm smiled faintly. Good. The attention had shifted. New stories replaced his. New outrage cycles bloomed and faded. Malcolm became what the media called a reference point. He preferred something else. One evening, a knock came at the gate. A young couple stood there, hesitant. The man held a folder. The woman clutched her purse tightly. "Mr. Wright?" the man asked. "Yes. We were told you might be willing to talk to us," the woman said. "Our son was stopped last week." Malcolm opened the gate without a word. They sat at the dining table where so many conversations had already taken place. The story unfolded in halting sentences. Fear. Confusion. Silence afterward. Malcolm listened. "I can't promise outcomes," he said when they finished. "But I can promise you won't be alone." They left with resources, contacts, and something less tangible: permission to speak. Afterward, Malcolm stood in the doorway for a long moment, the air heavy with what lingered after people left. This was what remained. Not vindication. Responsibility. The house had changed him. Or perhaps it had revealed something that had always been there. On the anniversary of the arrest, Malcolm returned to the driveway alone. Same stone. Same gate. Same quiet. He stood exactly where he had been cuffed. The memory surfaced uninvited. The red and blue lights, the voice stripped of curiosity, the certainty that explanation would fail. Malcolm inhaled slowly. Then he stepped forward. The movement felt small, intentional. Inside, life continued. A local paper ran a brief follow-up piece. No photos. No commentary. Just a paragraph noting the community programs hosted at the property once described as out of place. Malcolm clipped it and set it aside. Some nights, he still dreamed of doors that wouldn't open. Other nights, he dreamed of rooms full of voices. Both were real. At a citywide forum, Malcolm was asked a question he'd come to expect. Do you forgive them? He considered the phrasing carefully. I don't think forgiveness is the goal, he said. Change is. The audience sat with that. Later, walking back to his car, a uniformed officer approached him. Not Alvarez. Someone new. Younger. Sir, the officer said, then paused. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? Malcolm asked. For making it harder to look away, the officer replied. Malcolm nodded once. He didn't smile. Some lessons were meant to stay uncomfortable. At home, Malcolm began renovating the study. Not because it needed improvement, but because he wanted to reclaim the space on his own terms. He replaced the desk, changed the lighting, opened the windows wider. Ownership, he'd learned, was active. One evening, as rain fell softly against the glass, Malcolm pulled the old security footage from the night of the arrest. He hadn't watched it in months. He pressed play. The man on the screen stood straight, calm, keys visible in his hand. Malcolm watched without flinching. Then he turned it off. He didn't need it anymore. The gate camera blinked steadily outside, recording nothing remarkable. As summer approached, the gatherings grew smaller, more organic. Barbecues, book discussions, quiet conversations that didn't need agendas. The house no longer felt like a symbol, felt like a place. On a warm evening, Malcolm sat on the front steps, shoes off, listening to the street breathe. Somewhere down the block, laughter rose and fell. A neighbor walked past, then stopped. Good night, Malcolm, she said. Good night, he replied. The simplicity of it surprised him. Inside, the lights adjusted automatically as he moved through the rooms. Systems responding. Space acknowledging presence. Before bed, Malcolm wrote again in the same notebook. Justice doesn't end a story. Changes who gets to tell the next one. He closed the book and set it on the shelf. Lying in the dark, Malcolm let the silence exist without interpreting it. The memory was still there. So was the future. Neither owned him anymore. Outside, the gate stood firm, not as a barrier, but as a boundary he controlled. And Malcolm Wright slept, not perfectly, not peacefully, but honestly, knowing that what remained after injustice was not emptiness. It was work, and it was his.